Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Jason Redman. He's a U.S. Navy veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq. He's a U.S. Navy SEAL. His attitude after being severely injured in Iraq became an inspiration for many wounded warriors. Jason is also the author of The Trident, The Forging and Reforging of a Navy SEAL Leader. And Jason, thanks so much for being with us.
Greg, honored. Thank you.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
So I was born in Ohio, little town, kind of southeast of Columbus, Shockton, Ohio.
Okay, and there's a history of service in your family, correct?
There is, absolutely. So I grew up always wanting to be in the military, just hearing the stories. My grandfather had a very distinguished career in World War II. He was a B-24 pilot flying in the European theater. He flew all of his missions, even was shot down over Yugoslavia, and they crash landed the plane. And thankfully, it was winter, so they crash landed in the snow. Everybody survived, and then he led his crew. They evaded back to friendly lines to Italy, and he got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission. And then 7 air medals over his combat career. Never got to meet him. Came home and died of a heart attack after the war. So, but then my dad followed suit. He went in the Army. I was the black sheep and joined the Navy. My brother was a Marine and my sister was Air Force.
Why the Navy?
Specifically for the SEAL teams.
Okay.
Growing up, I grew up in the age of G.I. Joe, like many young men, and just kind of became very intrigued by the special operations side of the military, and initially looked at Army long-range recon patrols and Rangers and the Green Berets. And my dad had done some work with the SEALs in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And he said, hey, there's a group of guys out there, they say their training's the hardest. They jump out of planes, they blow stuff up, everything's from the water, they swim. He said, you may want to look into that. And I did, about the age of 15, and I said, that's where I'm going.
What was that training like? We hear the stories all the time, but for someone who's actually been through it?
I mean, it's tough, and it's neat because I've had the unique perspective of going through not only SEAL training, I went through Ranger school, and a lot of people always ask me, well, what's harder? SEAL training is just, it's brutally hard. There's no doubt about it. It's designed to be that way. As you get further away from it, though, you forget. I had the honor of going back about probably 5 or 6 years ago now, watching a class go through Hell Week, and it brought back a lot of memories. But I think the biggest thing that puts it in context is the statistics. So my class, I started with class 200, and we started with 148 students, and I didn't even graduate with my original class. I graduated in class 202, but 200 only graduated 19. So that was its, loss ratio, sticking right around an average attrition rate of 75% for SEAL training.
Was there any point where you were close to tapping out?
Yeah. When I was going through Hell Week is one of the hardest blocks of training, many say in the U.S. military, some say in some of the world's militaries, but it's 1 week straight where you get very limited sleep. If you're lucky, you may get 2 or 3 hours of sleep for that entire week. Starts on Sunday, you go till Friday afternoon, early evening, and you're constantly wet, coated in sand, you're constantly moving, you're cold, and it is just hell. And I had been told that if I could make it to sunrise on Wednesday morning, it got easier. So I wrapped my head around that tidbit of information, and it was my lifeline that I hung on to. So the sun rose on Wednesday morning, and I was like, I'm telling buddies, hey, it's all downhill from here. We made it, except we had not. Thursday night was my hardest night of Hell Week. The temperature in San Diego dropped that night down into the high 40s. My boat crew was losing every single race, and when you lose, you're punished for it through unique extra exercises or extra moments, freezing in the cold surf, and that's exactly what was happening. And I kept thinking back, this is BS. Wednesday morning came and went. It's supposed to be easier, and it wasn't. For a few moments, I thought about quitting. And but I told myself, look, if you quit, this goal is done. So it kept me in there, and I pushed through to the other side and finished Hell Week.
What was the feeling when you finished?
Amazing. It is amazing. You're so tired, though. It is a fatigue. The only time I've ever felt a fatigue that heavy, and even more so, was when I was shot and bleeding out. You're so tired, you can't even think straight. And you're so cold that that's all you could think about. So the biggest thing I remember about post-Hell Week was once we finally were secured, we had a community shower that was probably about 10 feet wide and about 15 feet long. And there was probably, 10 shower heads that lined the walls. And I took one of the metal chairs out of my room and put it right in the center of the shower, and I turned on all the shower heads on hot, and I just sat in the shower and slept in there for at least a couple of hours before I went to bed. That's the biggest thing I remember after Hell Week.
Finally got to warm up a little bit.
Yeah.
Man. So after all of this, where were you assigned pre-9/11?
So pre-9/11, I was an East Coast SEAL my entire career. My first SEAL team was SEAL Team 4. And at that time, the United States was heavily involved in the drug war. So we were really working hard to try and stem the flow of drugs coming out of South America. So a lot of the things that I did early in my career prior to 9/11 was jungle counter-drug related in Colombia, Peru, and working with our foreign counterparts, special forces and government agencies on things like that. Did a stint in training where I was teaching reconnaissance and surveillance, communications, things like that, where I moved into an area where I got recommended for a commission, picked up for a commission, and headed off to school.
So after 9/11, how does that change where you're deployed?
But changed everything. I mean, literally, 9/11 changed everything. I mean, I don't know how much, I'm sure it impacted the military as a whole on the same level, but within the SEAL teams, it was a absolutely dynamic shift in everything. It shifted in the way we deployed. It shifted in the way we configured the SEAL teams. It shifted in our tactics. Up until 9/11, the SEAL teams, the last time the SEAL teams had seen heavy sustained combat was Vietnam. So many of the tactics that we were still teaching was from the Vietnam War. We were also using a lot of old Soviet doctrine, that obviously played in. But it was 9/11, we got into this very ambiguous, very heavy urban and close quarters combat, mountainous, long range desert combat. And it made us really take a look at, gosh, a lot of the things we're doing have changed. Like I said, the deployment cycle changed. Prior to 9/11, the SEAL teams were geographically specific to areas of the world. And after 9/11, the demand was so high on special operations forces that they reconfigured how the SEAL teams deployed, and every single SEAL team became worldwide deployable.
Afghanistan, you were there before you went to Iraq, correct? And what was, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but what type of missions and type of responsibilities were you taking on there?
The SEAL team's primary mission is probably our primary mission is direct action. Mm-hmm. So we are going after individuals, so find, fix, and finish the enemy. So whether we capture those individuals or whether we aid them on their way. And that's specifically what we were doing in Afghanistan. So we were doing what we call capture-kill missions. So operated different places in Afghanistan, and everything from individual target takedowns to sometimes long-range patrols where we were patrolling through valleys and dense areas up in the mountains where we knew there was heavy enemy activity, and we were looking for caves. We blew up a lot of caves. So those were some of the missions that we were doing in Afghanistan.
How would you describe the Taliban or whatever other groups you were fighting there? Were they competent? Did they provide challenges that you expected or didn't expect?
Yeah, they were definitely competent. I mean, they are people who have been at war for many years. I mean, they held off the Soviets, and you would be ignorant to think that they didn't know what they were doing. You had to fight them on their terrain, in their backyard. in an area that they knew very well, and in an area that they had used very effectively against the Soviet Army. So you had to go in that, and you had to respect that heavily. They were very good at using the terrain, and we had to be very aware of that. So we recognized we had to maintain an extremely high level of fitness to be able to operate at these high altitudes and to be able to maneuver quickly in this really steep mountainous terrain. That was where they liked to fight.
How did you counter the home field advantage there? Well, how did you, if they know where all the mountain passages go and you don't, how do you overcome that?
Extensive intel collection, extensive understanding of terrain, extensive prepping the battlefield, if you will.
All right, let's talk about Iraq now. When did you go there?
I showed up in Iraq in the spring of 2007, which was right at we were kind of into the height of the Anbar Awakening at that point. So the Anbar Awakening occurred in the fall of 2006, and I showed up in Fallujah, so we were operating all throughout Al-Anbar. Iraq was a really hard war. We saw a lot of progress in the beginning of the war, which I wasn't there then. I was in Afghanistan. And then it really stalled, and we got deep into this insurgency. Al-Qaeda, you had different tribes who were involved in fighting for different areas. So you had the Sunni Shia mix with Muqtada al-Sadr and Baghdad trying to hang on to their piece of the pie, and then Al-Qaeda, which is Sunni, was hanging on to their piece of the pie, much more so and heavily involved out in Al-Anbar. So the Iraqi people, for years, having been subjugated and, held under this tyrannical rule of Hussein, did not trust anyone, including us. And they made it very difficult for us to operate because they would not provide any information. And what happened with the Anbar Awakening is in 2006, finally the tribal sheikhs came together and said, okay, Al-Qaeda and the insurgency is killing far more of our people than, the Americans in this war is. They've been here for a while. They keep telling us they want to help us. They have done some good things, so let's help them. And that was really the turning point in the war for us in Iraq. It really started providing information, actionable information, that we suddenly really started to turn the tide, where we were able to, with pinpoint accuracy, go after mid-level and high-level leaders and take them out or capture them. And so it was really active. I mean, that deployment that I did in Iraq in 2007 was, I like to say everything I ever trained to do as a SEAL. I mean, we were operating almost every night, very kinetic operations, going in after very bad people, and like I said, either wrapping them up or aiding them on their way.
What happened the day you were shot?
We were taking down a target. It was the end of the deployment, and we were going into an area, Karma, Iraq, which is northeast of Fallujah. And Karma, Fallujah was really a battleground holding point for Al-Qaeda. And they had fought for it in 2004, obviously, and then again in 2006. And then the 2006 battle really kind of pushed Al-Qaeda out of most of Fallujah, and they moved up into Karma. And the Marines had an outpost in Karma, and they tried to be as active as they could, but it ebbed and flowed depending on the units that were operating in that area at the time. So when we got there, we came to find out that not many units had been out in rural Karma, and that we were told there was a lot of activity. So the very first deployment that our troop went into Karma, I wasn't on that mission. It was a huge firefight they got into, and Petty Officer Clark Schwedler was killed, SEAL. We had multiple guys wounded, and we knew that, this was the area we needed to be in. So we just started going into Karma and developing more information about Karma throughout that deployment. So fast forward to the end of the deployment, we had been in multiple firefights in Karma. We had been tracking the number one leader for all of Al-Qaeda for the Anbar province in this area of Karma. And we got word that he was going to be in a specific time and location, time-sensitive target for us. And we launched on that mission, fully expecting heavy resistance. We entered the target and nothing, as often happens in combat and with intelligence, it can be dated. And we went into this building and there was a lot of activity. It looked like people had been there recently, but nothing was there. So we stood down. We found a lot of bomb-making equipment. We found munitions. So we found a lot of activity indicating, this was definitely part of the insurgency or Al-Qaeda. So we were going to blow that up and we were going to head out for the night. And our snipers saw some individuals flee from a house about 150 yards away. And they ran across the road and went into about 5 individuals into a thicket, some thick brush. And the ground force commander came up to me and said, hey, I want you to take your team. Let's go up there. Let's find out who these guys are. Let's question them. Because it was 3 a.m. in the morning. Iraq had a curfew at the time. Most individuals, when they heard helicopters, explosions, anything like that, they stayed away from it. The only people that came to it were the individuals looking for a fight. We saw these individuals run to hide, so we thought, okay, they're trying to hide. There may be something to this. Maneuvered my team around, and long story short, we walked right into a very well-executed Al-Qaeda ambush. What we found out later was the leader had left the building that we initially took down, moved to this other house about 150 yards away, and the 5 individuals that came out were the last part of his very well-trained security detail. And they had pre-staged an ambush line in that thicket with the idea thinking that we may drive up to the house to take it down, or we would land our helicopters in the field across from this thicket. Instead, we basically walked right into the kill zone where they were, which started a very effective ambush, hitting my medic, hitting me at least 8 times that we know of, and hitting one of our other guys who managed to run forward and save our medic. The only point of cover we had, it was nothing but thousands of yards of empty desert. And the only point of cover we had was a large tractor tire, like a John Deere tractor tire. So my team fell back to that. I was still out front at that point, and I had already been shot multiple times across the body. I had taken 2 rounds in the left arm, which at that point I thought my arm had been shot off. And I was pinned down by multiple machine guns, and I was continuing to try and shoot, got up to move and try and get back to the tire when I caught a round in the face. Impacted the right side, traveled through my face, exited the right side of my nose, took out my right cheekbone, took off most of my nose, vaporized the orbital floor, broke all the bones above the eye, destroyed the head of my jaw, and shattered my jaw down to my chin and knocked me out. So guys saw me fall unconscious, thought I was dead, continued to fight, requested a fire mission, but we were so close to the enemy that had us pinned down that we were well within the danger close parameters. The rounds would have killed us, is basically what the aircraft overhead. We had an Air Force AC-130 gunship overhead. Continued to fight. I came to at some point and woke up and literally was watching rounds travel directly over me. Thankfully had enough wherewithal to not sit up and enough wherewithal to realize that there was nothing I could do until my teammates won the fight. So I waited. In a lull and fire, I called out to my team leader and asked him how long till the medevac, and he told me, it's going to be just a few minutes, which was a lie. So, and I ping him on that. But they continued to fight. They continued to try and pin the enemy down. They requested the fire mission again, and the gunship said, no, we can't do it. You guys got to figure out a way to fall back. He called back and said, there's no way. There's no place to go. It's nothing but open desert. We have 1 point of cover, and we're making our stand here. So continued to fight, and finally he called back 3rd time and said, hey, look, we're running out of ammo. It had been probably about 30 minutes at this point. And he said, hey, running out of ammo. I got 3 severely injured, 1, potential KIA. He said that, if you don't bring in this fire mission, nobody's going to be left. So finally they relented and they agreed. He told them exactly how to do it, and it was pretty amazing. He called out to me and said, incoming, And I literally, you could hear the rounds go off and impact the ground in front of us, and the explosion blew up over us. So multiple 40 millimeter rounds. The machine gun that had me pinned down was hit in either that first initial volley or the second one, but I'll never forget that the gunfire stopped and the enemy fighter was crying out. He was in pain. He'd been hit pretty badly, and he was calling out to Allah. And I remember thinking to myself, stand by, because he's coming. And sure enough, they brought in the next fire mission, and that eliminated him. During that point, my team leader ran forward and grabbed me and dragged me back to the tire. He got a tourniquet on my arm, so he saved my life. And a few more fire missions were brought in, which finally neutralized the enemy, and we finally were able to bring in the medevac. Estimate 35 to 40 minutes from the time of initial impact. The medevac was on standby, which literally, I have to credit that to saving our lives. I read in Secretary Gates' book how much they really pushed to strategically place our medevac assets in strategic locations on standby based off operations that were going on in the theater during those nighttime to enable the greatest success for us that had been wounded to get to the combat support hospital within that golden hour. And it absolutely happened for me. I mean, they picked us up and they flew the rotors off that helicopter to get us to Baghdad. And I think I got into the OR probably right close to that hour mark with nothing left. And that medical team saved my life.
At what point did you understand fully just how serious the injuries were?
Pretty quickly. I knew that I couldn't get my tourniquet on. I knew I was losing a lot of blood. And I tell people, I knew I was dying. I mean, I had learned enough about medical trauma. We're trained in battlefield trauma, and I knew enough that I was going into shock, and I was going into hypovolemic shock from the loss of blood. And what was happening is I could feel my body was trying to save itself. I was getting cold in my extremities. I was losing feeling and the ability to move in the extremities because my body was trying to pull stuff into my core to keep me alive. And it just got harder and harder to breathe. It got harder and harder to think. Every breath, I felt like I was running, at full sprint. And I was like, you're going to die here. I said a prayer, and a thought popped into my head, and the thought was I had seen a show, Baghdad ER. And on that show, they talked about that if our wounded warriors showed up in the combat support hospital with a pulse, the military trauma professionals had a 90% chance of saving them. And that became my focus and my goal. So I just focused on stay awake to stay alive, stay awake to stay alive. And that was just kind of my mantra right up to the point that, they wheeled me in and the bright lights of the OR came on.
Clinging to that spot, it's like getting to Wednesday morning sunrise, only this time they were right.
They were right, yeah, thank God. Thank God. Although there is a funny story that happened in the operating room, a little bit of a Wednesday morning moment. Uh-huh. So I got into the operating room and I was like, okay, I made it, I can let go. They could, if I die right now, they'll bust out a crash cart, they can bring me back. But, I've got all the people here, they've got the tools, they've got the talent. And I was letting go and drifting off. And I felt this tug on my left side. And this nurse yells out, "He's still got a bomb on him." And when they took all my gear off, I used to carry a grenade on my belt. So they had removed all my gear, but they had missed this grenade. And they don't like explosives in the operating room. Doctors and nurses and all of them are not trained to deal with those things. So they are trained that if there are explosives, they clear the operating room. And they have somebody who's trained to get rid of it. So yeah, here I am, I'm dying. And he's got a bomb on him, and it looked like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, like Roadrunner, nothing but clouds of dust, and I'm in there alone, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm like, I'm dying. And I think the last thought I remember was, oh my God, what a bad day.
Obviously the surgery was successful.
Yes.
They stabilized you, got you home, and then a time later, you became famous for having a sign on your door at Walter Reed that said this: "Attention to all who enter here. If you are coming into this room with sorrow or to feel sorry for my wounds, go elsewhere. The wounds I received, I got in a job I love, doing it for people I love, supporting the freedom of a country I deeply love. I am incredibly tough and will make a full recovery. What is full? That is the absolute, utmost physically my body has the ability to recover. Then I will push that about 20% further through sheer mental tenacity. This room you're about to enter is a room of fun, optimism, and intense, rapid regrowth. If you are not prepared for that, go elsewhere. Explain what inspired that and what happened once people saw that.
Yeah, so what inspired that was I had some individuals that came into the room that were expressing pity over the wounds that I had received, and just going ahead and writing me and other wounded warriors off that, you know, what a tragedy. We send these young men and women off to war, and then they come home broken, and they're never going to be able to, you know, realize their full potential or something along those lines. So when they left, my wife came back. I couldn't talk, you know, wired shut, trach, stomach tube, the works. And I could only write on a notebook. And I wrote to her, I said, never again. Nobody is going to come into my room and feel sorry for me. I refuse to feel sorry for myself. And I penned out that sign. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought that went into it. It was like just a stream of consciousness in the moment. And I told her to get the brightest piece of paper she could find and put it on the door. And I said, nobody's allowed into my room until they read this. And if they can't handle that, then tell them they're not allowed to come in. And a New York firefighter who I later became friends with took a picture of the sign and wrote a blog about it, and it went viral. It just went everywhere. And it took on a life of its own. So much so that President Bush invited me to the White House. My family and I got to meet him in the fall of 2008. But what's really neat about the sign, we donated the sign because I didn't feel like it was mine. So many people want to make this big deal. Oh, you're the guy that wrote the sign. But the sign, I speak so much about this idea of the overcome mindset. And the sign is the epitome of that mindset. And the overcome mindset is nothing but a choice. It is a choice to either quit or to keep driving forward. And in that moment, I chose to keep driving forward. And there's so many other wounded warriors that have done the same. So that's why I felt like it wasn't mine. It was ours. And, you know, we had it framed with the current campaign medals and the Purple Heart, and it hangs at the Wounded Ward at Bethesda National Medical Center, continuing to motivate and inspire other wounded warriors. I talk to many who tell me that before a surgery, they touch it before they go into their surgery as they go by.
That's awesome. That's awesome. 37 surgeries, 15 skin grafts, among other medical procedures. And obviously your attitude, wounded wear, which is another thing that you founded, has helped a lot of different wounded warriors. But I know one of the things you're working on now and deeply concerned with is the ongoing suicide rate among our veterans. And so too many don't have either, I don't know how you would describe it, either this mindset or they just struggle in other ways. So what do you want folks to know about what wounded warriors and others are going through?
So there's two things that are going to help us win this war. Make no mistake, we are losing this war right now. There is, you know, for all the wars we've had, it is the war at home that's the most insidious. And, you know, we talk about this statistic, anywhere from 20 to 22 veterans a day who are taking their own lives. We lost a little over, the current numbers are a little over 7,000 individuals from the global war on terror since 9/11. Well, we are losing that number every single year. Every hour and 20 minutes, we're losing a veteran. There are two things that are going to help us win this war. One is purpose. They are struggling to find their purpose in the civilian world. All you have to do is watch the news to see how difficult, I mean, it's difficult for the average person who's lived here their whole life right now to find purpose. We're so divided. We're so angry. Everybody just, you know, we're so split to the extremes. And our guys and gals that have been to war come home and they're like, you got to be kidding me. You know, I fought for this, to provide the freedom and opportunity, and this is what you're doing with it. So many of them are lost to figure out what is their new purpose. You go from a military unit that gives you a mission and a very specific purpose, and you come home and you're like, so much these guys reach out to me and they say, I'm lost. I don't know how to live without a war. So that is the number one thing we have to do. We have to help them find a purpose. I meet companies and individuals that, I run a program called the Overcome Academy, and the first thing they ask me is, are you going to get them a job? As if a job is some sort of magic wand that's going to make them feel better. A job is merely a means to provide us money, which obviously the world runs on. But if you find the right job, it gives you a purpose. And what we need to do is teach them how to lead themselves to find that purpose. What's going to accomplish that? Money, funding, programs that can help them do it. It's not a yellow ribbon on the back of your car. It's not buying a Grunt Style or Ranger Up t-shirt, although I love those companies. They're phenomenal. I have some myself. And it's not doing the Murph WOD and CrossFit. All those things are great. But if you are not directly contributing in some way to a good organization that is out there that is directly helping them find a purpose, then you're not helping. Second is research. We know for a fact, there's a lot of studies that are going on right now that the impact of explosives on the brain are having long-term damaging effects. And there's this new study that's going on that there's a very strong correlation between CTE is what a lot of these football players are being diagnosed with, concussive traumatic encephalitis, I believe. And they used to think we were having veterans that were killing themselves who had the exact same signs and symptoms in the brain as CTE. But recently, in about the last 4 or 5 years, they've come to learn that veterans' brains and the impact is totally different. CTE is off a single impact from a concussion, whereas I call it blast-related CTE. It's all the way through the brain. So the entire brain is being affected and rewired. So we have individuals like my buddy Ron Condrey, who was an 25-year decorated EOD guy. Ron had an amazing purpose after he got out. He was living his dream, beautiful wife, doing what he wanted to do. He killed himself a month ago. How? Well, I think it's because Ron had blast-related CTE. So research is the next one. We need veterans to donate their brains. I'm working with the Concussion Legacy Foundation, same group that's doing work with the NFL. I donated my brain. We don't have enough veteran brains in the brain bank to be able to study to truly understand, because right now there are no biomarkers that we can find that can help us stop these guys and gals, that can help us say, hey, listen, yes, you have PTSD, yes, you have a traumatic brain injury, but it's to the level that it's literally affecting and impacting in the way you think, and to the point that you're making these erratic decisions like killing yourself. So those are the two biggest things, funding and research, and that's the way we're going to win this war. And I, if you truly say you care about our veterans, I need you to get involved.
Jason, powerful statement, and I hope a lot of people hear it, because what you just explained is absolutely right. Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you so much for being with us here today.
Greg, my honor, man.
Jason Redman is a U.S. Navy veteran, U.S. Navy SEAL of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.